November 20, 1943, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. A Japanese machine gunner named Corporal Todao Onuki crouched inside his reinforced concrete pillbox, listening to the thunder of American naval shells pounding the coral sand above him. He'd survived 3 days of bombardment in this bunker walls 2 feet thick, firing slits barely wide enough for his Nambu machine gun. The Americans would come soon. They always came after the shelling stopped, but Onuki didn't know what couldn't know was that the Marines waiting toward his beach carried a weapon that would fundamentally change how men died on Pacific Islands. When that first stream of liquid fire arced through his firing slit, transforming his concrete sanctuary into a blast furnace in less than 3 seconds. Corporal Onuki became one of the first Japanese soldiers to experience what would become the most feared weapon in the Pacific War. Not artillery, not bombs dropped from B-29s, not even the atomic weapons that would end the war. The portable flamethrower. The Japanese had spent months, sometimes years, Pacific Islands into fortified killing grounds. They'd carved bunkers from solid rock. They'd built pillboxes that could withstand direct hits from battleship guns. They'd created defensive positions so perfect that American commanders estimated it would take 10 Marines to kill one Japanese defender. But there was one thing Japanese military doctrine hadn't prepared them for, and by the time they understood what they were facing, it was already too late. This is the story of how a 70-pound backpack weapon broke the deadliest defensive strategy in military history, and why Japanese soldiers came to fear it more than death itself. To understand why the flamethrower shocked Japanese defenders so completely, you need to understand the strategic nightmare facing American forces in the Pacific by late 1943. The Japanese Empire had spent the first 2 years of the war fortifying every island they controlled, and they'd learned something crucial from their losses at Guadalcanal and in New Guinea. Meeting the Americans on the beaches was suicide. American naval firepower was simply too overwhelming, so Japanese defensive doctrine evolved. Instead of defending at the waterline, they would let the Americans land. Let them think they'd secured the beach. Then, from carefully concealed positions hundreds of yards inland, they would unleash hell. The architect of this new strategy was a brilliant and ruthless officer named Colonel Tadamichi on islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. His defensive philosophy would be implemented with terrifying effectiveness. Every hill became a fortress. Every cave became a bunker. Every natural depression became a machine gun nest. These weren't simple dugouts. Japanese engineers, many of them trained in modern concrete construction, built defensive networks that were engineering marvels. On Tarawa, American intelligence estimated maybe 300 defensive positions. The actual number exceeded 500 pillboxes with walls 6 feet thick, bunkers roofed with steel rails and coconut logs, then covered with 4 feet of coral sand. Artillery positions carved so deep into limestone caves that naval shells simply couldn't reach them. The Japanese defenders understood something profound. If they could force the Americans to root them out, position by position, man by man, the cost in American casualties would be so high that public support for the war might collapse. And initially, it was working. At Tarawa, in November 1943, it took the 2nd Marine Division 3 days of the most brutal combat in Marine Corps history to secure an island barely 2 miles long. More than 1,000 Marines died on Betio. Another 2,000 were wounded. The American public, seeing photographs of bodies floating in the surf and beaches carpeted with dead Marines, was horrified. Military planners faced a grim calculation. If Tarawa tiny coral atoll cost over 3,000 casualties, what would it cost to take the Philippines, Okinawa, the Japanese home islands themselves? Did you know that some projections for invading mainland Japan estimated American casualties could exceed 1 million men? That's not propaganda, that was the real math based on the casualty rates at places like Tarawa, and later at Peleliu. This is where the flamethrower enters the story. But not as some revolutionary new invention. Flamethrowers had existed since World War I, where German Flammenwerfer units had terrorized Allied trenches. The problem was that early flamethrowers were heavy and suicidally dangerous to operate. What changed in the Pacific was necessity. American Marines landing on Tarawa tried everything against Japanese bunkers. Artillery shells that demolished buildings couldn't penetrate 6 feet of sand and coral. Rifle grenades bounced off concrete walls. Even direct hits from tank guns often failed to silence machine gun nests. The Marines learned quickly. To clear a Japanese bunker, you needed to get close. Impossibly close, you needed to get a demolition charge, a canvas satchel, packed with explosives right against the firing slit or into the entrance, which meant someone had to crawl forward while machine gun fire kicked up coral dust all around them. Then somehow jam explosives into an opening where enemy soldiers were shooting at them from 3 feet away. The casualty rate for these demolition teams was catastrophic. On some beaches, 50% or higher. But at Tarawa, a few Marine units had brought along something experimental. The M1A1 portable. It wasn't much to look at, basically 2 cylindrical fuel tanks strapped to a backpack frame. with a wand and igniter assembly that looked like something cobbled together in a garage, and at first, Marines weren't sure they wanted it. The M1A1 weighed 72 pounds when fully loaded. It had a range of barely 50 feet, and you had to get dangerously close to use its well-within rifle. The range of any defender with a clear shot, but when that first burst of burning fuel hit a Japanese pillbox on Red Beach 2, something profound happened. The flamethrower didn't just kill defenders. It didn't just set things on fire. What it did was far more psychologically devastating. It made impregnable positions completely untenable. A bunker that could withstand artillery fire couldn't withstand a weapon that shot burning gasoline through its firing slits. There was no defense against it. No amount of concrete helped. No thickness of walls mattered. Marines who'd tried everything else to clear bunkers, without success, suddenly had a weapon that worked every single time. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, watching flamethrowers work on Tarawa, wrote in his after-action report, "The backpack flamethrower won universal acclaim from the Marines on Betio. Each battalion commander recommended increases in quantity, range, and mobility." By the time the battle ended on November 23, 1943, American commanders knew they'd found their answer to Japanese bunker warfare. They had no idea just how much the Japanese had noticed. 2. In the months following Tarawa, something remarkable happened in the Pacific. A weapons race that would transform how both sides fought. The United States ramped up flamethrower production immediately. By early 1944, the Marine Corps had developed the M22 flamethrower, an improved version with better range, more reliable ignition, and fuel tanks that held 4 gallons of thickened gasoline. This wasn't regular gasoline anymore. Engineers had developed napalm, gasoline mixed with aluminum salts that turned it into a gel. Napalm stuck to everything it touched. It burned at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it kept burning for up to 10 seconds after contact. The M222 could shoot flames 65 feet, twice the range of the M1A1. With maximum pressure, operators could push streams of fire out to 130 feet. And unlike earlier models, the M222 could be refueled and put back into action in under 2 minutes. But here's what made the flamethrower truly devastating. It wasn't just the fire that killed Japanese defenders. It was what the fire did to the air inside enclosed positions. When burning napalm enters a confined space like a bunker or cave, it doesn't just cause burns, it consumes oxygen violently. The temperature inside an enclosed position hit by a flamethrower can spike to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Anyone inside faces 3 simultaneous threats. The fire itself, temperatures hot enough to sear lungs with a single breath. In rapid oxygen deprivation, Japanese soldiers who survived flamethrower attacks reported feeling as if the air was being sucked from their lungs, which is exactly what was happening. The combustion was so intense it created a temporary vacuum, literally pulling the breath out of defenders before the flames even reached them. Did you know that some Japanese soldiers, facing a flamethrower attack, chose to shoot themselves rather than burn? Post-war interviews with survivors revealed this wasn't uncommon. The psychological impact of seeing that stream of liquid fire was so overwhelming that trained, disciplined soldiersmen who'd been prepared to die for the emperor chose instant death over what the flames promised. By mid-1944, every Marine division in the Pacific had dedicated flamethrower platoons, 3 men per rifle company, 72 men per division, all specially trained. They practiced for hours how to approach a bunker under covering fire, how to aim for firing slits and entrances, how to keep moving after discharging fuel because standing still meant death. These men knew the odds. The flamethrower operator was always the priority target. Japanese defenders learned fast. If you saw the distinctive silhouette of those twin fuel tanks, you shot that Marine first. If you were facing a flamethrower team, you didn't waste ammunition on riflemen, you aimed every bullet at the man with the wand. The statistics tell the story. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, some Marine flamethrower units suffered casualty rates exceeding 90%. 90%. That meant if 10 men started the battle carrying flamethrowers, only 1 might finish it unwounded. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in active combat was estimated at 4 minutes. 4 minutes. But here's what's remarkable. Marines kept volunteering, because as dangerous as carrying a flamethrower was, it was still safer than assaulting bunkers without one. Demolition teams without flamethrower support often suffered even higher casualties. The flamethrower, for all its risks, worked. It cleared positions that nothing else could touch. Meanwhile, the Japanese were desperately trying to adapt. After Japanese military intelligence compiled detailed reports on American flamethrower tactics. These reports circulated throughout Pacific garrisons. Defensive manuals were updated. New countermeasures were proposed. Some seemed almost reasonable. Build bunkers with multiple chambers so fire couldn't reach all defenders at once. Design firing slits with protective baffles that could be closed when flamethrowers approached. Create multiple escape routes so defenders could withdraw rather than die. In place, other proposals revealed growing desperation. Issue defenders with water-soaked cloths to wrap around their faces. Train soldiers to charge flamethrower operators before they could fire. Place snipers specifically to target the distinctive fuel tank. Silhouette. Nothing worked consistently. The fundamental problem was this. The flamethrower had turned Japanese defensive strategy inside out. Everything they'd done to make bunkers impregnable, thick walls, limited entrances, concealed positions actually made them more vulnerable to flamethrowers, not less. Those thick walls that stopped artillery shells also trapped heat and fire. Those limited entrances that prevented Marine rushes also prevented defenders from escaping when flames poured in. Those concealed positions were perfect until fire found them. Then there was nowhere to run. At Peleliu, in September 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had constructed what he believed was the perfect defensive position, a system of more than 500 interconnected caves in a formation called the U Pocket, a coral ridge so rugged that even veteran Marines called it the most difficult terrain they'd ever fought in. Caves were engineering masterpieces. Some had multiple levels. Many connected through tunnels to other positions. Defenders could pop up, fire, then vanish underground before Marines could return fire. Artillery couldn't reach them. Airstrikes were useless against entrances hidden in cliff faces. Some caves were so deep that battleship shells fired at point-blank range did nothing but chip the rock. For weeks, the 1st Marine Division bled trying to root out these positions. Conventional tactics failed utterly. Companies would spend entire days assaulting a single cave entrance, only to have defenders retreat through tunnels and reappear elsewhere. Then the flamethrower tanks arrived. The United States had developed something the Japanese hadn't anticipated, the M4A3R3 Satan tank. It was a standard Sherman tank with the main gun replaced by a massive flamethrower capable of shooting fire 150 yards. The fuel tank held 290 gallons of napalm. It could deliver sustained flame for up to 60 seconds. An eternity compared to the 7-second bursts from portable units. When 8 of these flame tanks rolled into the Umerbrugel on October 4, 1944, something broke in Japanese defensive psychology. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, fighting with the 1st Marine Division at Peleliu, later wrote about the moment a flame tank reached a cave complex that had held up his company for 2 days. The flame tank pulled up, and the gunner sent a long jet of flame into the cave mouth. We could hear screaming. Some Japanese ran out on fire. The riflemen shot them down, but most never came out. The caves that had been impregnable fortresses became death traps. Defenders couldn't retreat. The flames followed them through the tunnels. They couldn't surrender. Many chose suicide over burning. They couldn't fight back effectively by the time flames reached them. It was already over. Japanese military commanders began sending increasingly desperate messages back to Tokyo. Radio intercepts translated after the war revealed the psychological collapse. American flame weapons make defense impossible. Positions we spent months fortifying fall in minutes to their fire weapons. Soldiers prefer death to capture after seeing what the flames do. Did you know that on Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashita, brilliant tactician who'd designed the island's defensive network, devoted several pages of his defensive plans specifically to countering flamethrowers? He proposed building water reservoirs at cave entrances that could be released to flood positions before flames reached them. He suggested training soldiers to fight through flame attacks rather than retreat. He even proposed counter-flamethrower units armed with their own fire weapons. None of it worked. Iwo Jima, despite being perhaps the most heavily fortified 8 square miles on Earth, fell to American forces in 35 days. Flamethrowers were instrumental in clearing the island's estimated 11 miles of tunnels and more than 450 defensive positions. Marine Corporal Herschel Woody Williams became the face of flamethrower warfare at Iwo Jima on February 23, 1945. The same day the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. Williams spent 4 hours methodically clearing Japanese with 4 riflemen providing covering fire. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to get close enough to use his M2-2. He cleared 7 pillboxes that day, 7 positions that had stopped multiple Marine platoons for hours. Williams would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. But what's remarkable about his citation isn't just his courage, it's what it reveals about flamethrower tactics. The Medal of Honor citation describes Williams fighting desperately against intense enemy small arms and mortar fire, repeatedly returning to his own lines to prepare fresh demolition charges. He wasn't a one-man army. He was part of a carefully coordinated team, riflemen to suppress enemy fire, fellow Marines to refuel his weapon, others to provide demolition charges for positions too deep for flames alone. This was flamethrower warfare by mid-1945, a specialized, coordinated tactic executed by highly trained operators who knew they probably wouldn't survive the battle, but did it anyway because nothing else worked. Japanese defenders, watching from surviving positions, sent a final message that was intercepted and translated. The Marines have brought the devil's weapon. We cannot hold against it. April 1, 1945, the invasion of Okinawa, the last major battle before the planned invasion of mainland Japan. By now, both sides knew exactly what to expect. The Americans would bring lots of them. The Japanese would build defensive positions specifically designed to counter them, and thousands of men on both sides would die. In the collision between unstoppable force and a movable object, what happened on Okinawa crystallized everything the Pacific War had become, a brutal arithmetic of fire against fortification. Where victory went to, whoever could endure the most suffering. Lieutenant General Mitsuru, commanding Japanese forces on Okinawa, had studied every battle since Tora. He knew the Americans would bring. He'd read the reports from Peleliu and Iwo Jima. He understood that traditional bunker defenses were now death traps, so Ushijima did something different. He built his defensive lines on Okinawa's southern ridges and hills, where interconnected positions could support each other. The idea was elegant. When Americans attacked one position with flamethrowers, defenders in adjacent positions would kill the flamethrower operators before they could fire. Cross-supporting fields of fire, interlocking kill zones, no position left unsupported. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it just took longer. The battle for Kakazu Ridge in mid-April 1945 demonstrates why. This coral ridge, barely 300 feet high, had been fortified with dozens of caves and tunnels. Japanese defenders had clear sightlines covering every approach. Any Marine trying to reach a cave entrance would be exposed to fire from at least 3 other positions. The 96th Infantry Division spent 8 days trying to take Kakazu Ridge. Casualties were staggering. Hundreds of men lost trying to advance against positions they couldn't even see until they were in killing range. Then the flamethrower teams arrived, supported by flame tanks. Private First Class Gerald Averill, operating a flamethrower with the 96th Division, described the assault in an interview years later. We had tanks with big flamethrowers hit the main cave entrances while we went after the smaller positions. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see 5 feet. Japanese soldiers came running out of some caves before we even fired. The smoke from other positions was sucking the air out of the whole tunnel system. Some of them were already dead from smoke inhalation before they reached daylight. This wasn't just combat. This was industrial-scale killing powered by evolved tactics and specialized equipment. Flamethrower teams had become lethal, coordinated units. They knew exactly how to approach different position types. They understood fire behavior in confined spaces. They could judge from smoke patterns whether defenders were still alive inside. But what truly broke Japanese resistance on Okinawa wasn't just the flamethrowers themselves. It was what they represented, the complete failure of Japan's defensive strategy. Every tactic the Japanese tried had failed. Every innovation had been countered. The Marines had become so proficient at flamethrower warfare that positions taking hours to reduce in 1943 now fell in minutes. Even the most dedicated defenders couldn't hold against coordinated flame attacks. Supported by infantry and armor, Japanese military leaders knew what this meant. If Okinawa, with 100,000 defenders and months of preparation, could fall to American forces, then mainland Japan had no hope. The mathematics were inescapable. Did you know that by the end of the Okinawa campaign, Japanese tactical reports stopped even discussing how to counter flame? Post-war analysis of captured documents shows a shift in late April 1945. Instead of trying to survive flame attacks, Japanese defenders were instructed to kill as many Americans as possible before the flames reached them. It was a tacit admission that defense was impossible. The best they could hope for was a few more American casualties before they died. For American Marines and soldiers, the flamethrower had become something more than a weapon. It was a talisman, a guarantee, the one thing they could count on when everything else failed. Companies without flamethrower support considered themselves at terrible risk. Units with flame tanks felt nearly invincible. 100-year-old Marine veteran Don Graves, who operated a flamethrower on Okinawa, recalled in an interview before his death, "The Japanese feared that fire. You could see it in how they fought. When we showed up with the flamethrowers, they knew it was over. Sometimes they'd charge us, just come running, screaming, trying to get killed before the fire reached them, because they knew what fire did to men inside those caves, and they preferred bullets." The casualties tell their own story. On Iwo Jima, one Marine flamethrower unit, Tate Men, suffered a 92% casualty rate. 7 of those 8 men were killed or wounded, but those 8 men, in just 3 days, cleared 37 defensive positions that had stopped multiple companies for hours. 30-7 positions, 8 men, 3 days. That's the brutal mathematics that ended Japanese defensive warfare in the Pacific by June 1945. As American forces were mopping up the last resistance on Okinawa, the implications were clear to everyone. An invasion of mainland Japan would require flamethrowers on a scale never before seen. The United States began planning for flamethrower divisions, entire units built around flame warfare, flame tank battalions, portable flamethrower regiments, specialized flame engineers. Japanese planners, reading intelligence reports about American preparations, understood exactly what was coming. Fire. unimaginable amounts of fire. The home islands would burn. Then, on August 6 and 9, 1945, something happened that made even the flamethrower seem almost quaint by comparison. Atomic weapons fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, the invasion that would have unleashed flamethrower warfare on the Japanese. Home island's operation downfall never happened, but the threat of it, the certainty of it, may have been part of what finally broke Japanese will to continue fighting. Because by August 1945, every Japanese military commander knew that American forces had perfected the art of burning defenders out of fortified positions, and they knew that no defensive preparation, no amount of courage, no level of dedication could stop it. When the war ended, both sides began assessing what the flamethrower had meant. The conclusions were sobering. For the United States Marine Corps, the flamethrower became enshrined as one of the war's most important tactical innovations. Nearly 25,000 M22 flamethrowers were produced during World War II. They were used on every major Pacific island from Tarawa onward. At least 27 Medals of Honor were awarded to men who used flamethrowers in combat, nearly all of them posthumously. The men who'd operated them paid a terrible price. Casualty rates for flamethrower operators averaged between 40 and 50% across the entire Pacific campaign. On particularly deadly islands like Iwo Jima and Peleliu, rates exceeded 90%. The average combat life expectancy for a flamethrower operator at the time between entering combat and being killed or wounded was estimated at just 4 minutes. Think about that. 4 minutes. Barely enough time to clear 2 or 3 positions before statistically, your number was up. Woody Williams, the Medal of Honor recipient, who cleared 7 pillboxes on Iwo Jima, lived to be 98 years old. He spent the rest of his life after the war honoring the men who didn't make it home. When asked in an interview why he'd volunteered to carry the flamethrower on the horrific casualty rates, Williams said simply, "Somebody had to do it, and it saved lives in the long run. Every pillbox we cleared meant fewer Marines died attacking it conventionally." He was right. Post-war analysis by military historians concluded that flamethrowers probably reduced overall Marine casualties in the Pacific by as much as 30%. Yes, the operators suffered catastrophic losses. But before flamethrowers, entire companies would be decimated trying to reduce bunkers with explosives and small arms fire. Flamethrowers, for all their horror, made impossible positions possible to take. For the Japanese, the flamethrower became a symbol of American material superiority and of the futility of their defensive strategy. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese soldiers revealed profound psychological scars. Many reported nightmares about fire. Some couldn't be near open flames without panic attacks. The flamethrower had traumatized an entire generation of defenders in a way that bullets and artillery shells simply hadn't. Lieutenant Satoru Omura, who survived the Battle of Okinawa by surrendering before flames reached his position, told American interrogators in September 1945, "We were told to fear nothing, to embrace death for the Emperor. But when we saw the flames coming, all that training disappeared. It wasn't the dying that terrified us, we were prepared to die. It was how we would die. The fire took away our courage." That admission from a Japanese officer trained in the Bushido tradition to never show fear reveals something profound about what the flamethrower represented. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological breaking point. The thing that made even the most dedicated defenders doubt their ability to continue fighting. After the war, the flamethrower's effectiveness in the Pacific influenced military tactics worldwide. The United States continued developing flame weapons through the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The M222 was eventually replaced by more advanced models, but the core tactical doctrine remained. Fire was uniquely effective against fortified positions. Other nations took note. The Soviet Union developed its own flamethrower units. NATO forces trained with flame weapons as part of standard infantry tactics. For decades, the flamethrower remained a standard part of modern military arsenals. Then, in the 1970s, something changed. Growing international concern about the weapon's horrific effects led to the Protocol on Incendiary Weapons in 1980, restricting their use. The United States military began phasing out portable flamethrowers in the 1970s. The last flame tank was retired in 1974. Today, the flamethrower exists primarily in historical memory and museum displays. The M222 units that terrified Japanese defenders now sit behind glass in military museums. Veterans who carried them are nearly all gone. Woody Williams, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Pacific Theater, died in June 2022. But the impact remains. Every military in the world studies what happened in the Pacific. Every analysis of fortified warfare includes sections on flamethrower tactics. The weapon that shocked Japanese soldiers in 1943 became a case study in how technology can overturn even the most sophisticated defensive strategies. The Japanese fortifications that fell to flamethrowers are still there, scattered across Pacific islands. You can visit them today. The pillboxes on Tarawa's Red Beach, the cave systems at Peleliu's Umerbergal Ridge, The tunnel networks beneath Iwo Jima, many still show scorch marks from 80-year-old flame attacks. Inside some caves, coral walls are discolored, the rock itself melted by heat exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These ruins stand as monuments to a brutal truth. In war, no position is truly impregnable. There's always something, some weapon, some tactic, some innovation that can turn a fortress into a tomb. The story of the flamethrower in the Pacific teaches us something uncomfortable about warfare and human innovation. The Japanese built what they believed were perfect defenses. They poured months of labor into bunkers and caves. They studied American tactics and adapted. They fought with courage and dedication that even their enemies acknowledged. And none of it mattered. Because war, at its core, is a competition between defense and offense. And throughout history, offense eventually wins. The castle walls that resisted siege engines for centuries fell to gunpowder artillery. The trenches that defined World War I warfare were broken by tanks and combined arms tactics. And the Pacific bunkers that seemed invincible in 1943 were cleared by a backpack weapon operated by men who knew they probably wouldn't survive the day. There's a deeper lesson here about human conflict and technological change. Japanese defenders weren't cowards. They weren't unprepared. They were simply on the wrong side of military innovation. They'd built a defensive system optimized for the warfare of night, not realizing that American forces were evolving tactics specifically designed to defeat exactly those positions. By the time Japanese commanders understood what they faced, it was too late to adapt. The fortifications were already built. The defensive doctrine was already established. The soldiers were already trained. Changing everything would have taken years they didn't have, so they fought with what they had, knowing it wasn't enough. That's the tragedy of the Pacific War's defensive battles. Not that Japanese soldiers lacked courage, but that their courage was spent defending positions that had become obsolete. For the Marines who carried those 70-pound flamethrowers into combat, the lesson was simpler and harder. Sometimes saving lives means taking horrific risks with your own. Those men with their 4-minute life expectancies and 90% casualty rates knew exactly what they were signing up for. They did it anyway because their brothers in arms were dying trying to take bunkers without them. Woody Williams, during his Medal of Honor ceremony, said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was thinking about the guys behind me, the ones who'd get killed if I didn't get that pillbox. When you see it that way, carrying the flamethrower isn't courage, it's just math. That's a remarkable statement. It's just math. As if choosing to carry a weapon that would almost certainly get you killed was simply a logical calculation. But Williams was right in a sense. Given the alternatives, given the casualties from conventional tactics, the flamethrower for all its risks was the mathematically correct choice. Today, we look back on flamethrower warfare with a mix of horror and fascination. It seems impossibly brutal, inhumane, the kind of weapon that shouldn't exist in civilized warfare. But the young Marines fighting on Pacific Islands in 1944 and 1945 didn't have the luxury of philosophical debate. They had bunkers to clear, positions to take, brothers to save. And the flamethrower, for all its horror, worked when nothing else did. When those Japanese soldiers on Tarawa Peleliu in Okinawa first saw streams of liquid fire arcing through the jungle air toward their positions, they weren't just shocked by the weapon itself. They were shocked by what it represented. The end of their defensive strategy, the collapse of their tactical advantage, the realization that American forces had found an answer to their strongest positions. In those moments between seeing the flame and feeling its heat, Japanese defenders understood a truth that military historians would spend decades analyzing. Fortifications only work until someone develops a specific weapon to defeat them. And once that weapon exists, once it's deployed and refined and understood, the fortress becomes a tomb. The flamethrower didn't just shock Japanese soldiers, it broke the fundamental logic of their defensive warfare. And in doing so, it helped end the Pacific War months, maybe years, sooner than it might have otherwise ended. That's the real legacy, not just the weapon itself, but the lesson it taught about adaptation, innovation, and the brutal mathematics of survival in total war.